Neofeud is a 2017 cyberpunk point-and-click adventure game released in late 2017 by Silver Spoon Games, a one-man outfit comprised of Christian Miller, a venture game studio, and a lot of time spent in Photoshop. Miller, besides working on passion projects such as this, is a streamer, blogger, and outspoken political activist, all while teaching STEM subjects for underprivileged kids in Honolulu. By all accounts from what I can see of his streams and debates, he seems to be a really nice guy. Which is why it really does pain me to say that while I loved Neofeud as a concept, as an expression of one man's love of the cyberpunk genre and a desire to make a game that actually says something, much of this video is going to involve me tearing it to pieces. I'll be going into this in far more depth and detail later, but as is tradition, and in case anyone watching this wants to avoid any spoilers, we'll cover the review bit right now and get into the analysis after that. Neofeud is made on the free adventure game studio engine and, for the most part, is a striking, imaginative and competently designed blend of light puzzle solving and interactive novel-style storytelling that draws deeply from classic cyberpunk tropes as well as contemporary political, economic and social subjects. Make no mistake, Neofeud is a game with a lot to say, and that desire to put a message across bleeds into just about everything. Visually, and it's worth stating here that it's almost undoubtedly the most polarising element that seems to come up for and against the game in other reviews, Neofeud is the product of one man basically jacking his brain into Photoshop and dreaming really hard down the pipe. While the composition and objective quality of the artwork itself isn't always great, the rendering of character portraits in particular veers between competent and unintentionally hilarious at times, the overall style is consistent and quite often the sheer imagination on display is more than enough to offset any objections one could have on not meeting personal standards. Speaking of composition, while the art may be polarising, one area that has been universally praised, and rightfully so, is the soundtrack. Again, composed in-house, these tracks blend low, roaring guitars with crunchy sampling and a solid array of synths to suit nearly any occasion, from the cool, rhythmic title sequence to some absolutely dirty drum and bass and Santana-esque noodling for the more intense action sequences. The OST is actually available separately, and quite frankly, even if the game doesn't appeal, the soundtrack alone may justify the price of admission. Where things start to get a little more debatable is where we move away from the presentation and move into the actual guts of the game itself. As I said earlier, being made in Adventure Game Studio, Neofeud is robust in terms of stability and accessibility, but there are clear signs that this game took shape as the engine was being discovered. The least offensive are just visual quirks, like our protagonist, Skull Carbon, not having alternate animations for movement and interactions, mean that his cybernetic arm simply switches between left and right, depending on which way he's facing. To be fair, this would have required redrawing all of Carl's animations and creating new movement loops to correct something that doesn't really impact the game itself. What's less acceptable are issues such as the UI itself being an extremely busy, intrusive pop-out from the top of the screen, packing in the save and load buttons where extra inventory space really would have been welcome. Similarly, while not going all the way to pixel hunting, some objects contain secondary objects within their interactable area, a doorknob being distinct from a door for example. Spending several minutes trying to find some object you thought you'd missed, only to discover that you just hadn't moused over the right bit of something you'd already looked at is... okay, no, we're not going to get that sour. A highlight feature would have been useful. Occasionally the game does explicitly state that there's something on a particular item you need to look at in detail, but it's inconsistent and it caught me out more than once. It's no more jank than you find in any other solo project, and while I found some parts of it to be mechanically clunky, the puzzles themselves were concise and made a good amount of sense. Something in particular I did really enjoy was Carl's aforementioned arm, which contains a personal computer, knife, taser, and gas cutter, all of which are put to use in a variety of situations and feel 1,000 times better than simply mashing random objects together to find the correct solution. The game also curates your own inventory in a way that, while feeling a little forced, streamlines puzzle solving by handing you the relevant items and leaving it to you to find the correct uses for them. Even in the later stages of the game, where gunfights break out or we run the risk of getting Carl killed, the game is good enough to autosave prior to each one of these potential game overs, not punishing you for failure should you misclick or decide to take a more comically suicidal course of action. In fact, for the most part, Neofeud is a good game. Despite lacking aesthetic polish, it never feels badly made, and shows a good grasp of not only the fundamentals of how a game like this should play, but how the experience of the player can be refined and improved in the process. Really, the only part of the game I had a sustained problem with was, unfortunately, the writing. To keep this short and without spoiling anything major, the main problem with Neofeud's writing is that it's unfocused. Absolutely passionate, opinionated and informed, but at the same time overblown, overwritten, and capable of bringing the gameplay to a crashing halt as characters trade small mountain ranges of text. In the late game in particular, several minutes can go by as corporate strawmen gloat about the joys of being so fucking ludicrously rich and corrupt that I felt like I'd actually wandered into a Neil Breen movie.
Money, payoffs, and greed were always the priority of my company, like many companies. I'm afraid of going to prison. They now know my crimes.
Neofeud's ideas in particular feel less coherent as the game presses on. We begin with a direct, scathing portrayal of a welfare system manipulated to exclude those who need it the most, something which feels like it's lifted directly out of Christian Miller's own experiences. It's packed with sympathetic characters and helps flesh out the world from the ground up. A few hours later, though, and all of that feels a million miles away from the grand sci-fi concepts and politics that Neofeud ends up devolving into. Knowing that it's coming up front may soften the blow a little, but for me, coming in blind, it felt like I'd started watching The Wire and ended up with Dynasty. If you're happy to just sink into the setting and take things as they come, then Neofeud's writing is no worse than any other brick-thick cyberpunk paperback, full of discourse and tangential world-building. But as someone who came into this expecting something more focused, more critical and informed, I was left wanting. Anyway, that's more than enough to give anyone still on the fence a sufficient kick one way or the other. Personally, I love Neofeud as a project. I'm absolutely on board to check out the sequel that's already in production, but I can't honestly say that I thought it was good in the ways that mattered. Cool. Anyone who doesn't want to hear me spoil literally the entire game, now's the time to get out of here. Neofeud, as a setting, is deliberately, almost furiously provocative. Marrying all the guilt and pomp of monarchistic rule with the cold, soulless efficiency of unfettered corporate dominance, the new 1% are the hateful love child of the Borgias and the Kardashians, with dynasties like the Cockjobs and the Clinton Bushes serving as paper-thin expies of the all-too-real political and economic powerhouses that shape our world today. Below them are the other 99% of society, comprised of defective robots, unwanted or obsolete genetic chimeras, and anyone else simply unlucky enough not to be born into ludicrous wealth. Poverty, drug abuse, and obtrusive bureaucracy are endemic, with the very concept of sentience now arbitrated by the Goetzel-Takeda test, a system which we later discover is intentionally biased to strip human rights from those who are unmistakably deserving of them. The game establishes this platform from which to absolutely eviscerate the ruling classes, the Neofeudals, from top to bottom, from ivory tower penthouses to street-walking bigots who act as unwitting cannon fodder. You can feel the seething frustration, the righteous fury bleeding from every syllable when the game drills into a specific issue, but that exact same anger often ends up sputtering out in execution. For all that Neofeud draws from a place of justifiable anger and a desire to change the world for the better, it does a terrible job of articulating itself in a way that stays relevant and engaging for the player. Conversations run on and on, peppered with the occasional pop culture reference, or more commonly, overburdened with stiff, infomercial-like breakdowns of income inequality, legal reform, or simply how ludicrously fucking evil the neo-feudal elite are, sometimes from their very own mouths. It's never enough to completely take me out of the game itself, and for the most part, I fully agree with a lot of what Neofeud has to say, but it struggles to properly articulate itself often enough that I found myself just staring vacantly into the middle distance, waiting for the conversation to end so I could get back to the game itself. To be honest, I'll always prefer any game that's got something to say over one that's got nothing to say at all, but that message lives or dies in the execution. Anyway, that's enough for now. I'm not done talking about Neofeud's messages, but to get there we need to, get there, so to speak. Fuck it. Transition! Neofeud begins with a day in the life of Carl Carbon, disgraced ex-cop turned social worker for the city of Coastlandia's overburdened Department of Sentient Services. We follow him through his commute through the slums that comprise much of the Earth's landmass, gazing covetously at the luxury flying cars that they were promised, but only neo-feudals ever got. It's a strong opening, establishing a lot of the larger and smaller scale threads to come, and in my opinion these first 3 hours or so are the tightest and most cohesive. The sweeping score and dense, grungy, artistic style immediately set the tone for this cyberpunk world. Cheap food and duct tape, worn-down prosthetics, and failed promises of a future that didn't come to pass for the majority. Everything from Carl's bitter, snarky internal monologue that feels like a homage to your classic noir gumshoe archetype, to the vacant lots crowded with homeless, exude this sense of all-too-real decay decay that already exists in our world. Neofeud just utilises this to bring it to our attention. Not 5 feet through the door, thanks to his chronically malfunctioning cyberarm, Carl manages to lose his consciousness card, physical proof that he's a sentient being. It's that kind of world. In the process of getting it back, we wind up aiding a robot girl attempting to cheat the Gertzel-Tarkada test in order to qualify for benefits, and nearly get shot in the fucking face for it by an overzealous security guard. I've heard of hostile work environments, but I didn't think we'd be dealing with anything quite this literal. Finally able to sit down at his desk, intermittently tackling his literal mountains of paperwork and catching some shut-eye, we're rudely interrupted by our boss, Norton Shuffler, reminding Carl that he's got a house call to make. Ex-con and parole flight risk, Johnny Silica, aka Protege, aka the $6 billion baller, hasn't turned up for any of his mandated court appearances, so Carl's got to go and track his nickel-plated arse down. This search leads us to Sunrise Apartments, a mixed-income tenement block where Johnny's foster family lives. Part project housing, part ad hoc shantytown, where the walls are rebuilt with car chassis and the power is illegally jacked from the main grid. This is also where the first proper inconsistency with the writing versus the game itself starts to show up. As I mentioned, we're here to find Johnny. Carl even has a picture of him on his monitor while he's getting briefed, and it's implied he has some knowledge or run-in with him before. So it's bizarre that even when we're literally threatening to frame this kid with drug possession so we can steal his e-cig, it makes slightly more sense in context, that nobody makes this glaringly obvious connection. Speaking of gross violations of personal and professional ethics, now's as good a time as any to talk about... As far as protagonists go, Carl Carbon isn't exactly your typical dashing do-gooder. A slovenly, crude, and inherently bitter middle-aged desk jockey doesn't really make for much of a role model for the player to imprint onto. However, it does make him an excellent vehicle through which we can explore Neofeud's world. That very same beat-down attitude actually makes Carl a far more interesting and reliable narrator, whereas a more idealistic protagonist would undoubtedly keep being corrected or have things explained to him. Carl's narration is far more holistic, taking what we've already seen and adding that vital piece of context in order to bring it to life. Carl is, in my opinion, the best written character in the entire game, but in a very particular kind of way. It's not so much the aspects of Carl's backstory, or the development he makes along the way, both of which I'll be discussing later on, but the way in which he's presented to the player and how his personality reflects the actions you take together. Now, to be fair, it's a staple of the point-and-click genre that any protagonist is going to be complicit in some light theft, deceit, and property damage at bare minimum. Sometimes the game will call out this behaviour, or at least make light of it, but rarely is the integrity of the protagonists themselves ever brought into real question. Carl, on the other hand, is far more morally dubious. On the one hand, the most surface reading, he's a man who has a clear sense of right and wrong, who understands the injustices of the world and at the very least wants to do something about it. It's just that he's also a manipulative, bullying, backsliding coward who only ever seems to act with confidence when he's in a position of unassailable power. Early on, this actually manages to make Carl somewhat morbidly endearing, mirroring our own internal conflict of our ideal self versus the shabby, flabby reality. We've all dreamed of making huge changes in our lives, standing up to the people we hate and effecting real change, but few of us ever actually go through with it. For that, at least, Carl is quite painfully relatable. What makes it so appealing, at least to me, is that it dismantles the usual objective approach one would take to making moral choices. More often than not, morality in video games is less of a question of personal ethics and more of a practical weighing of gameplay repercussions or the desire to see a particular ending. By giving Carl distinct opinions on events, even if he's reluctant to act upon them, the decisions we make now have a consistent weight, either reinforcing or breaking from his established pattern of behaviour. Case in point, returning to where we were in the story, we now go through the classic Rube Goldberg process of puzzle solving in an adventure game. Due to Carl's short-term memory problems, we need to ask around to figure out where Johnny could be. A nice old lady with an extremely cavalier approach to our own personal safety suggests that we should bust into the city's grid and siphon off some free power to the apartments, then she'd be willing to help. Quite understandably, Carl's reluctant to go and commit several felonies, but since she's holding the keys to our progress, he caves and gets cracking. That personal weakness coming to the fore as he realises that he has no real authority out here. Compare that to the very next stage of this puzzle, where we need Johnny's e-cig to repair Carl's oxyacetylene torch so he can pop open the casing of the power converter, which, to be fair, at least makes clear logical sense for an adventure game. We see a very different side to Carl's moral compass. Working a corrupt cop angle that feels all too genuine for Carl, we sniff out a vial of mythium, the equivalent for meth for sentient machines, and use this to strong-arm Johnny with some textbook abuse of power. Carl literally says once he's got what he wants,
"Thank Jobs for unfettered abuse of power."
Which is, encouraging to hear from the protagonist of a game where the dominant themes are centered around social justice and how power is wielded over a helpless populace. Sure, this won't become a problem later on. Any fucking way, we pop the lock, jack the juice, and return to Granny to discover that she's not going to tell us that we walked right by Johnny and stole his shit, but instead give us the code to an admittedly punk as fuck car radio / door lock. This in turn gets us in touch with the Silicas, Johnny's robotic foster family, who let us into their apartment with a minimum of Carl acting like a colossal fuckbag. Despite the somewhat shaky preamble, this next section is actually one of the strongest, most intimate moments of the game. Carl asks a few questions as to Johnny's whereabouts, gets a lead on where to go next, and then decides that now's as good a time as any to conduct that welfare check he was supposed to do. The welfare check itself is a simple tick-the-box form covering the basics of child welfare and indicators of lawful activity in the home, your stock standard quality of life stuff. However, what becomes clear after even a cursory glance over the form is that these questions are standardised for human households. If Carl were to follow this form to the letter, it would be nearly impossible for any non-human household to pass muster. As we inspect the apartment and chat with the family, the father being a PTSD-suffering combat veteran and the mother already nursing one of their own kids and with another on the way, it's made painfully apparent that the Silicas are doing the best they can with what they've got. It's a direct analogue to the very real compromises and difficulties that low-income families have to make day to day, and it lets us go even deeper into some of the more interesting ideas that Neofeud has. Even things as simple as a market for bootleg spare parts because the official legal replacements are prohibitively expensive. The real masterstroke is having our own input into the situation pass through the lens of Carl as a character. As I said earlier, we established that he has higher intentions, he has a moral code of some sort, but at the same time he's capable of abusing his authority and caves into pressure very easily. For Carl, the easy way out for this would be to bite down on his objections, run the inspection by the numbers, and more likely than not have the Silicas lose custody of their kids, if not go to jail. However, we as the player can act like some last vestigial part of Carl's conscience, refuse to be complicit in such a broken system, and instead turn a blind eye to the infractions that would see this family torn apart. If we were a blank slate, a character with no real established agency, then this choice wouldn't feel as meaningful, but by choosing to do the good thing in spite of Carl's established lack of self-esteem, we're essentially sowing the seed of rebellion in Carl's heart that'll go on to grow into something else as the game unfolds. Unfortunately, despite our input, the scene devolves rapidly. Completing the visit, Carl is contacted by his boss, Shuffler, and instructed to invent a reason for CPS to immediately take custody of the Silica's kids. Carl objects, but it's too little too late. A heavily armed team of cops storm the apartment, shoot Papa Silica dead, and abduct their newborn child. It's a horrifying scene, any parent's worst nightmare. Which is why the way in which this plotline sort of just stops later on is so depressing. But if I start flying off the handle at every damn thing Neofeud does wrong, I'm going to be here forever. Oh fuck, okay, and if you decide to toe the line and sell the family out, the dialogue and gameplay remain exactly the same, so it kinda kicks the legs out from under that grand act of character development, but anyway. Moving on, Carl races over to Dickinston, a robot-centric ghetto where Johnny is known to hang out at a local gang hotspot, the Arcade. We abuse a homeless junkie, help him overdose, vandalise a payphone, and blag our way past security. I'm trying to speed up a little because I know what's coming up, and oh god, it really isn't going to get any better. Inside, we chat up a few of the patrons, dropping Johnny's name to see what effect it will have, then hustle an off-duty dirty cop at Gallagher in order to lure the main man out. It makes slightly more sense in context, I think. The situation gets a touch out of hand, what with us antagonising an 8-foot cyber assassin with a terminal meth problem, before Johnny, aka Protege, steps in to cool things down, which means I can finally talk about Johnny Silica is going to be nice here and say he's the down-to-earth, streetwise hustler, the comic relief, because I've called him a nickel-plated racial stereotype that might come off as a bit strong. From the get-go, Johnny lives and breathes the archetypal hood lifestyle of drugs, guns, bitches and bling, peppered with comical misunderstandings, because he's from the hood and that means he has a room temperature IQ. Pop culture references to media and real-world events, which we're going to talk a whole lot about in a second. And enough racial epithets, sexist undertones, and general dick baggery that I spent much of his screen time trying not to peel my own face off in sheer fucking embarrassment. I'm not saying you can't write a character like this. There's a wealth of incredible media that delves deep into gang culture, how subcultures form and express themselves when they're cut off from the rest of society. Menace to Society, La Haine, City of God, even pulpier stuff like New Jack City all have something to say. You can do this well. It's just that Neofeud doesn't. We have the black and Hispanic communities represented by sentient machines, seemingly as an analogue, but barely see any in-the-flesh representation of people of colour. The same goes for chimeras and transgenic people, selectively bred to perform particular tasks, which kind of reads like it's trying to tap into transgender themes, but never hangs around long enough to actually cement anything. What frustrates me, and what Johnny is emblematic of, is a fundamental lack of substance to a lot of what Neofeud has to say about anything. It conjures up a fantastic world full of interesting premises and conflicts, but fails to populate it with actors that can actually interact with them. Johnny's actual role in the story as a whole is to really just to be a MacGuffin, a bearer of a superpower that holds the key to another MacGuffin that the bad guy wants to... There's no real depth to Johnny, compared to Carl or anyone else we encounter. He begins the game as a loudmouth, gun-toting cardboard cutout of a gangster and ends it in almost the exact same state, and it's such a fucking waste. Johnny could have been skewed in any other way, a low-level runner getting in over his head, or a shockingly competent and mature authority figure. We could have teased out some conflicts and shown some growth, but instead we get this.
Oh, dog! See the flies? Banging this Ben Affleck just as ever spy with my own motherfucking megapixels, dog. What you think? She out of my league? I might go interspecies to get with this shorty.
And I can't help but imagine how this could have been done better. Okay, let's actually focus on the plot again. Back in the room, the action, wherever, we're finally able to sit down and have a civilised conversation. Which is to say, Johnny pistol whips Carl in the face when he finds out his foster father got shot by the cops and his sibling got abducted. Which is, understandable. He uses his mind-reading plot device ability to tell that Carl is at the very least sorry for the whole debacle and gives him two options. Help Johnny save his foster sister or find a parking space for a .50 caliber pistol round somewhere in his skull. Naturally, Carl goes for the former. Then, in accordance with the laws of cyberpunk, the cops show up and start shooting everything in sight. It's our introduction to the action segments of Neofeud, and, to be honest, it's not that bad. Generous auto-saving and a fairly clear sense of what you need to do helps these scenes flow well enough, with Carl figuring a way out while Johnny lays down some cover fire. At no point, even into the later game, did I ever really find that death came out of nowhere or set me back an unfair amount, but I can definitely understand why some people didn't like unexpected cover shooter mechanics tucked into their sedate adventure game. Dodging cops, gunfire, and an absolute banger of a track, seriously I think it's my favourite track of the whole game, Carl and Johnny make it outside, only to run into a half dozen more cops. Well, shit. Luckily for us, luckily for Carl and Johnny, not so much as me, someone who wanted interesting things to happen, their impromptu Alamo moment is interrupted by the arrival of an alien-looking hover ship and a masked man who eliminates the cops with the power of violent strobe effects. It's at this point, right here, that Neofeud starts going downhill. More than before, I mean. Princess Sybil comes into the game at about the 3-hour mark, and at a stroke she completely destroys every plot point that had been established leading up to now. I'm not even slightly kidding. Aboard the superpositor, Sybil's private time machine, she explains that her father is after Johnny due to his aforementioned superpowers and how they relate to a reality-altering device called the Garden of Forking Paths, which was created by Goetzel of the Goetzel-Takeda test, so now we need to actually go and overthrow the entire established Neofeudal order. Sybil's arrival shitcans any possible attempt for Neofeud to tell a relatable story. We abandon the clearly established and relatable arcs that have been set up for Carl and Johnny, of personal growth and revenge respectively, and substitute them with a space opera level corporate power play that requires a full half-hour of exposition to even begin getting any traction. It doesn't help that as a character, Sybil is significantly less interesting than Carl or Johnny. At the very least, the other two have a certain degree of colourful abrasiveness that makes you pay attention to them when they're talking. Already hampered by fairly flat voice acting, most of what Sybil has to say comes off as the well-meaning but empty platitudes of a coddled neoliberal who's never so much as suffered a split end in her entire life. It's hard to take a lecture of wealth inequality seriously from someone who's wearing a dress worth more than your house and driving a car that routinely shags its way back and forth across the fabric of space and time. At this point, I should probably point out that Christian Miller has contended that Neofeud is a work of satire to some degree, that not all of what we're presented with should be taken strictly at face value. Fair enough. Sybil does smack of that kind of privileged white girl who went backpacking through Cambodia on her gap year and came back with a head full of wild ideas, but it never cashes in on it. Carl and Johnny lap her rhetoric up and are ready to go on wild adventures within minutes. Satire needs to skewer its subjects occasionally to let the audience breathe. Neofeud satire just sits there, bloated and inert. The other big pin pricking the balloon of tension and resulting in this really bad metaphor is the introduction of time travel. Even when you limit yourself to a 24-hour window, you're really just painting yourself into a corner where either A, time travel ends up solving everything, B, time travel ends up solving nothing, or very rarely C, time travel makes for an entertaining conceit for the plot to go and do cool stuff, or as I like to call it, the Bill and Ted option. Writing good time travel is really, really difficult at the best of times. You go beyond a few basic actions and all of a sudden you're having to correct your entire continuity to make it fit, or you ignore continuity entirely and just use it as a vehicle to make the plot happen, at which point all risk is off the table as there's now this big red reset button for us to mash when things get tricky. Oh shit, and there's also Sybil's companion slash golem slash gimp, who hangs around and occasionally makes shit happen with his mind. There's some very brief, vague stuff that made it seem like maybe he was Carl with the cyber hand and everything, but no. He just gets obliterated a little bit later on and that's about it. Anyway, we now begin... With Carl and Johnny, impressionable young souls that they are, now caught up in Sybil's plot to overthrow her dad, the team formulates a plan. Sort of. They have a rough idea of what they need to accomplish, figure out what the Garden of Walking Pass is, how Johnny figures into that, and ultimately how they're going to knock Cock Daddy off his gilded cyber throne. Their first stop, the last known location of Gertzel, is something of a bust. By the time we show up, he's stone dead with a big bloody hole in the side of his head. We admire some tacky warlord, fuck about with a smartphone, read his DMs, and accidentally get skull-fucked by the garden, which can apparently show us other, far more interesting alternate timelines. As a side note, the game makes it pretty clear early on that Gertzel took a 50 caliber pistol round to the dome, and what with there being only one character thus far who's been waving a gun like that around, you might have thought someone would have put 2 and 2 together, but no. It would have been interesting, have Johnny wonder how or why he'd come and shot this guy he didn't even know, but suspense is for cowards and we've got shit to do. Chased out of the lab by Gertzel's next-gen real doll, the gang figure out they can use the time machine to go back before the dude's death and figure out a way to prevent it. So they go and do something else instead. I suppose I should point out that although the game gives us options as to when and where we can go via the superpositor, we're still funneled through a linear sequence of scenes. Given that this is a one-man project, it's something I can absolutely forgive. Planning and implementing non-linear plot progression is tricky for full studios, let alone an indie, but it's still jarring for the characters to suggest one thing, then immediately go and do something else. Anyway, said other thing is to go and work over Norton Shuffler, the stuff suit that gave Carl the order to fudge his CPS visit, so he can get some answers. As a preamble, we're introduced to a couple more high-flying bit players, Mayor Laura, Sybil's cousin, and Nolan Gates Watson, Sybil's ex-boyfriend and contender for World's Thinnest Lips. They lounge around in their offices for a while, vacantly gloating about how splendidly things are going in the fucking the poor industry, what fun it is to be corrupt, and fuck it, I can't wait any longer! Christian Miller can't write an antagonist to save his fucking life. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, but I have to deploy the Garth Marenghi clip.
I know writers who use subtext, and they're all cowards.
I brought it up in the spoiler-free part of the review, but my God, I was really only scraping at the surface of what's wrong here. While the suffering underclasses may be uncomfortable racial analogues, at the very least they're written with some pathos, some humanity that makes me care for them. Even Johnny, the character equivalent of massaging lime juice directly into my eyes, has a background that's sympathetic and is ultimately a decent leader for his gang. Bar one example, every single member of the ruling elite is a comically evil strawman, a blood-drinking Pegasus-riding caricature. That by itself isn't strictly bad, it's only that strawmen are by design supposed to be targeted, knocked down. In satire you can paint an utterly farcical scene, but you have to then go and actually do something with it, turn it upside down, set a fire under it, anything. Neofeud does none of these things. It just presents you with a collage of pricks wrapped in Gucci and expects you to make something out by yourself. The worst part of it is, there's a clear example that this could have been done better. In the process of barging into Norton's office and interrupting his meeting, Carl manages to get an explanation out of his boss, and it's actually a shockingly humanising moment. Norton explains that he was, like Carl, stuck in a low-level position, struggling to support his family, when someone higher up offered him a promotion. No questions asked, just do the occasional bit of business off the books. At first, it's nothing more than some basic admin, the odd hiring of someone's nephew, but it quickly evolves into tampering with records and outright breaches of trust. Norton knows it's wrong, but it's keeping his family happy and living a better life than he'd ever imagined. While Norton may still be a tool of the greater powers, his story comes from a very relatable place. It puts context to his actions. He's the only one who gets anything close to this degree of development, and sure enough, this is basically the last we see of him. There's no closure to Norton's arc, no redemption or growth, but it's still far more than anyone else on this side of the story ever gets. Writing antagonists can be tricky, I can fully appreciate that, and sometimes you just want to have some gigantic hate sink for the audience to relish in the destruction of, but there's no scale, no shades of grey. Neofeud isn't interested in discussing the faults of unchecked capitalism and the manipulation of civil rights, so much as it just wants to loudly and angrily bellow, "Fuck this shit" in particular. It only gets worse the higher up we go. The Cockjob's Patriarch, a crude mashup of Colonel Kilgore and a dozen insensitive references to real-life conflicts, is perhaps the closest the game gets to genuine satire simply through how absurd he is. He's pure blood and guts machismo, and while it does make him an utterly horrible person, he's at least an entertaining clown. Whenever he shows up, you're at least guaranteed that something or something's going to get shot, blown up, or otherwise war-crimed. His counterpart, Warren Clinton Bush, Sybil's dad, doesn't even have the benefit of being a cartoon. He's a walking, talking Excel spreadsheet full of contempt and sociopathic malevolence. As an arch-antagonist, the main threat to the established world, he's little more than a greedy, petulant little bully with no real attachment to anyone or anything. His dynamic with his daughter is written out in a few brief statements, his vision for the future is vague and really only seems to be what things are like now, but with him holding the biggest stick. Without wanting to waste any more of our time, let's try and get back to the plot. Don't worry, we are trying to accelerate here. Knocking a Cockjob's gunship out of the air with a ballistic zero-G sex jacuzzi, a moment which admittedly did get a good giggle out of me, the guy dived back into the TARDIS superpositor thingy and decided to split up in order to handle some personal business. For Johnny, said business is trying to blow Norton's brains all over the consoles of the ship for staging the raid on his foster family. Remember that bit? Here's the resolution. Of course, being the good guys, we don't actually shoot Norton, but Johnny does leave Carl with a warning that buying into Sybil's big scheme without question may not be a good idea. We also just forget Norton exists after this conversation. I assume he's been shoved into a glove compartment somewhere on the ship. Anywho, Carl says he's going back to the Sunshine Apartments to ask around a little more, except he doesn't do that. I don't know how or why this managed to get into the game. It's a pretty big continuity error to just leave hanging, but I no longer have the energy to think about it. He actually heads back in time to the Sentient Services building that morning, the day when the story kicked off, presumably to check if Sybil's on the level, but I don't know how going here would give him any info on that, but if it ends up helping anyway, so fuck it just works. Turns out that robot woman from before, the one trying to hustle the Gertzel Takeda test, was actually Sybil re-sleeving into a robotic shell because she wanted to make sure that Carl would be the right man for the job. Understandably, Carl is rather pissed off about this and confronts her back on the ship, where after a good amount of trying to wriggle out of owning up, Cops the player manages to keep Carl on side by promising not to lie to him again, which is a solemn bond from someone who's been lying to you this entire time. Nice one, Carl, you fucking twit. Picking up Johnny en route at some point, we're not really showing what he got up to, we finally go back in time and save Gertzel from being shot in the face. Unfortunately, it's worse than we could have thought. Gertzel is alive, and he's fucking insufferable. I defy anyone to listen to more than a minute of this man's dialogue without wanting to slam the spacebar with their forehead until the pain goes away. His dialogue, his voice acting, his very essence is a perfect reduction of everything wrong with Neofeud. Bloated and meandering intellectual prose delivered in this holier-than-thou tone that had me begging to be the one to terminate this piss weevil myself. We persevere through what feels like an eternity of his waffling to discover that Gertzel has actually been supplying Johnny's gang with their drugs, as well as the man who sets up the raid on the arcade. Oh, and he's basically Johnny's dad. As you might imagine, Johnny doesn't take this well and brainfucks Dad into unconsciousness, writing us into such a pointless dead end that everyone just ends up leaving. At a few points throughout the game, it felt like whatever original vision that was had for Neofeud had to get shrunk down, but for whatever reason certain parts of the story had already been scripted or recorded, so these inconsistencies had to be worked around without really explaining what was going on. As we go into this final arc, know that I'm not going to mention all of them, but they are there. Back on the ship, with all previous routes to accomplishing anything having ended in total fucking failure, Sybil pulls out her ace card, pestering her dad. As you might have noticed, Sybil is a rather shit figurehead to lead social change, which makes Carl's boneheaded obedience and apparent romantic interest in her all the more nauseating. To cut a long story short, that goes nowhere, because why would it, and we head off to the G8 summit. Again, these things are pretty much just happening one after the other. I'm really trying to make sense of it as I write this and rewatch my Let's Play. I'm trying, damn it. At the summit, things go about as badly as you can imagine, with Warren Clinton Bush being poisoned and the Cockjob's military staging a coup, because, now trying to pass through the haze of military jargon, I think he just wants a war to happen? I think? Maybe. Narrowly evading capture thanks to Carl, Johnny and Johnny's mate Talos swooping in at the last minute to cut down a slew of guards, the gang escape into the Clinton Bush's sub-level, discovering a vast eugenics lab, because of course, and the proper version of the Garden of Forking Paths. Unfortunately, by turning it on, they've played right into Warren's hands, as he actually staged his death to allow his consciousness to upload into a remote server through which he could control the garden. I don't know, come on, we're nearly there. Warren then cuts about the place like a cheap Dr. Manhattan, bending reality to his whim, overthrowing the coup and dropping the cockjob Sky City onto a large portion of the slums below. Having waited exactly long enough for millions to have needlessly died like any good shonen protagonist, Johnny seizes the moment and unleashes his powers against Warren, only to get T-posed out of existence for his trouble. Defeated, Sybil and Carl are captured and taken to holding cells, where Carl is offered the chance to save his family from... oh, hang on. Shit! Okay, so yeah. Carl had a family that was mentioned maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the entire game, and now it has the gall, the absolute cheek, to dangle them in front of me like I should care. I will tolerate a lot, but if there is one thing that absolutely gets me from placid calm to bullet-spitting anger, it's any piece of media telling me I should care about a character, especially if it's because they're family. If you want me to establish a meaningful connection with anyone, anything, whatever it is, in whatever medium you desire, you have to spend time building it up. Drop little bits of backstory into the plot here and there. Have Carl refer to a keepsake now and again, like maybe make it a part of his cyberarm so we keep seeing it. Just plonking someone into a situation and telling them to forge an emotional connection to someone they've never really met or knew about is, at best, lazy writing and at worst just flat out condescending. The family in question, Jewel, his wife, and Johnny, his kid, who at the time I joke looked like he'd been hit in the face with a snow shovel, but also has MS, thus making me the bad guy all of a sudden, are held as part of a bargaining chip to keep Carl sweet, for reasons that escape me since at this point Warren is basically God. Anyway, he dangles various threats over Carl's head, revealing his adultery, his drug abuse, and... oh, come on. Trayvon Martin, aged 17, was shot to death by George Zimmerman following an altercation on the evening of February 26, 2012. The resulting investigation of the shooting, charges of second-degree murder and the subsequent acquittal of Zimmerman caused a media frenzy, once again highlighting the racial dynamics in America and how profiling and disproportionate force are leading to more deaths in black communities. This, amongst other tragedies, came to be the catalyst for the Black Lives Matter movement, a major international activist movement working against systemic racism wherever it may be. Neofeud takes the Trayvon Martin shooting, changes the name of the victim to Vatron Martin, and puts Carl behind the trigger. I don't know what caused Christian to think this was a good idea. It wasn't. I called it ghoulish at the time, and I stand by that. Drawing upon someone else's real-life tragedy, their loss, to do the most basic of asset flips to cyberpunk it, and then show the absolute brass balls to make the protagonist of your game the Zimmerman of the situation. Like, what am I supposed to make of this? Is Carl secretly a robot-hating fascist? It explained the shitty treatment of most of the sentient machines he's dealt with thus far, and maybe, just fucking maybe, if this had been brought up earlier and explored with some respect, then it could have been an interesting story to follow. Except none of that happens. It's dropped into the conversation and abandoned immediately afterwards. I've been pissed off at the game numerous times by this point, but not until then, at that moment, had I been directly pissed off at the writer himself. I doubt you'll see this video or make it this far into such a rambling diatribe, but if you're still watching this, hey buddy, fuck you. I decided to ignore the deal, mostly because I don't really trust Warren to hold up his edge of the bargain, but I wouldn't have trusted him to trade my freedom for a cheese sandwich, so that's neither here nor there. In the cell, we discover that Johnny is not quite dead, having become a ghost-faced killer in the machine. Oh, come on, that was such an easy joke. With whom we can engineer our escape. Knocking out some drones, we go bust out Sybil and figure that we can fool the Clinton Bush dynasty into believing that Warren is really dead. With no active backups, then he can't be king and Sybil takes his place. Which is absolutely the riveting high-octane climax I was waiting for. While Carl and Sybil fuck about with some plot shenanigans, Johnny finds himself back in Goetzel's lab again for some fucking reason that nobody in the scene can figure out. We have the stock "You're Not My Real Dad" daytime TV drama, and for a brief, shining moment, it looks like Johnny's going to shoot Goetzel, only to bitch out at the last moment. So Goetzel shoots himself. Wow, just Goetzel, world's worst dad. I don't know, I guess Goetzel couldn't live with himself any longer after treating Johnny so badly, although given the man's weapons-grade arrogance, I kinda doubt that. It feels like the whole plotline with him just meandered into a corner and couldn't find a neater way to close the loop. Fuck it. Back with Carl and Sybil, we successfully con the bureaucratic machine into accepting Sybil as queen, which gives Carl the opportunity to shank the still-beating heart of Warren's original body, where his main backup still resides. Unfortunately, this doesn't so much stop Warren as it unleashes his final form, the backup still connected to the garden. Johnny reappears, uses his powers to beat Warren back long enough for Sybil to slap his body with a bumper sticker we picked up earlier, and oh, holy shit, that's it. Warren dead, Sybil queened. Boom. And just when I thought this was all over, we get the epilogue, which is where I have even bigger complaints. From the outset, Neofeud has been about social reform, about how nepotism and a callous disregard for the rights of others literally dehumanises us. For all that it may have fumbled the execution, overwritten itself, and lost track of important tangents, that key message held true. Bear that in mind as I walk us through these final scenes. We cut to some time later. Carl, in the superpositor, tracks down his family and makes a much belated phone call. He apologises for being such a shitty husband and father, but tells them that now he's all cozy with the literal God Queen of Earth, he can wrangle unlimited money and perks their way. He quite literally says,
"A little nepotism never hurt anyone."
Which is, fucking antithetical to what we spent several hours trying to convey, but hold the fuck on because it's only going to get worse. We jump forward to Carl again, this time sitting in Norton's office, languidly chewing out Mayor Laura and Nolan Gates Watson over their various schemes and embezzlements. Amidst their various pathetic objections, not for one moment showing a trace of actual humanity or characterization, Sybil shows up to drop a great big fucking socialist hammer. State-enforced poverty! By which he means that for every 2 years of employment at their level, they have to spend a year at the lowest rung on the ladder. No money, no outside assistance. And if they die, the state seizes their assets. In no way could this possibly go wrong. The way in which Neofeud just basks in this is so utterly confusing. I can't tell if it's still gunning for a satirical old boss same as the new boss take on the transition of power, or if this is just morphing into some twisted revenge fantasy that borders on the fetishistic. Now that we're being told that absolute authority, how wielding terrifying weapons of mass destruction are totally fine, just so long as it's good people controlling them. Because that's never led to, several genocides. Oh, Jesus. Anyway, finally, damn near mercifully, we end with a final meeting between Carl and Johnny, back at the arcade, where our friend is living the hip-hop high life, with movie and album deals, and God, could someone stop this man from beating off on the track. I'm done. Fuck this entire ending. It's terrible, horrible, fuck it. Oh, and staying up Warren hidden in the arcade machine, somehow just go along with it. Fuck you. For all this review kind of devolved into random screaming and insults aimed at the creator, I can't bring myself to actually hate Neofeud. It clearly comes from a personal, meaningful place. This was a project that had purpose beyond turning a quick buck, but just because I can sympathise with it doesn't mean that I can excuse it. Between awkward political metaphors, the chronically overdone writing, and an overall message that completely loses sight of what it started out saying, Neofeud is loud, angry, and unfocused to the point of rambling, which is probably not too far off what this review turned out to be, so there we are. I'll still go and play Neofeud 2, which is in production, and because I want to see how Christian Miller develops as a writer and a creator. He has an eye for detail and a creative vision with a lot of potential, but like any amateur dealing in high-concept prose, he goes too deep too fast and loses sight of what made those first few hours so genuinely engaging. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully you found this review/long-form rant somewhat entertaining and informative. Until next time, have a good one. Goodbye.